The fluorescent lights in the courthouse corridor hummed with the same cold efficiency that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Helena Vasquez sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as waves of expensive suits swept past her like sharks circling wounded prey. The marble floors echoed with the confident clicks of Italian leather shoes, each step a reminder of the money and power arrayed against her. Across the hallway, Marcus Thornfield held court like a king surveying his domain. His custom-tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than most people made in 3 months, and he wore it with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. Silver cufflinks caught the harsh courthouse lighting as he gestured expansively to his assembled legal team, 5 attorneys in matching navy suits who hung on his every word like disciples receiving wisdom from their prophet. Marcus caught sight of Helena, and his lips curved into the predatory smile that had haunted her dreams for months. He whispered something to the lawyer nearest him, a sharp-featured woman whose blonde hair was pulled back so severely it looked painful. The woman glanced over at Helena and smirked before turning back to Marcus with a barely suppressed laugh. "I wonder where all of you watching this are from today," Helena thought to herself as she noticed more people gathering in the hallway, drawn by the obvious drama unfolding. Comment below and let me know what state or country you're calling home from as you hear this story, because what happens next proves that justice doesn't care about your zip code or bank account balance. Marcus strode across the corridor with the confidence of a man who had never lost a legal battle. His entourage followed like a well-orchestrated parade of legal intimidation. When he stopped in front of Helena, she had to crane her neck to meet his gaze, the height difference just another reminder of the power imbalance between them. "So Helena," Marcus said, his voice carrying just loud enough for the growing crowd of courthouse observers to hear clearly, "I see you finally found yourself some legal representation." His eyes swept dismissively toward the modest figure sitting beside her. "Tell me, where did you find this guy? In the yellow pages under discount legal services?" Helena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Patterson is a perfectly qualified attorney," she replied quietly. "He comes highly recommended and has agreed to represent me in this matter." Marcus threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls like gunshots. "Oh, I'm sure he does," he said, making no attempt to hide his amusement. "Let me guess, he works out of a strip mall office between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. Does he even have a proper law library? Or does he just use the public internet at the local coffee shop?" The lawyer beside Helena, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s named Robert Patterson, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses but said nothing. His gray suit was clean and pressed, but showed signs of age around the cuffs and collar. His briefcase was genuine leather but bore the scars of decades of use, and his shoes, while polished, had been resoled at least twice. Marcus noticed the crowd gathering and seemed to feed off their attention. "You know what your problem is, Helena," he continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "You always were too cheap to invest in quality. Remember when we were married, how you would buy store-brand everything, clip coupons like we were living in poverty when I was pulling in 7 figures a year? Well, congratulations, your bargain-hunting mentality has finally caught up with you in the worst possible way." The sharp-featured blonde lawyer stepped forward, her tablet computer gleaming as she consulted what appeared to be an extensive digital file. "Mrs. Vasquez," she said in a voice that could cut glass, "I am Patricia Hawthorne, senior partner at Hawthorne, Blackwell and Associates. We represent Mr. Thornfield in this matter, and I feel compelled to inform you that your current legal situation is far more serious than you seem to understand." Helena's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I understand the charges perfectly well, thank you." Patricia smiled like a shark scenting blood in the water. "Do you really? Because embezzling $400,000 from your former employer's pension fund is not exactly a shoplifting charge. This is a federal crime with a mandatory minimum sentence that could put you away for 15 to 20 years. And your little bargain basement lawyer here is going up against a legal team that has never lost a white-collar criminal case." Marcus leaned down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Helena's. "You should have thought about that before you tried to steal from Meridian Financial," he said, his breath hot against her ear. "Did you really think you were smart enough to outsmart the system? You who couldn't even balance our personal checkbook without overdraft fees. The courthouse corridor had grown quiet, with dozens of people now openly watching the confrontation unfold. Lawyers, defendants, family members, and court staff all seemed drawn to the drama like moths to a flame. Some pulled out their phones, clearly recording what they saw as an entertainment spectacle rather than a human being's life being destroyed in real time. Robert Patterson finally spoke, his voice so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear him. "Marcus, Patricia, perhaps we should save the theatrics for the courtroom where they belong." Marcus straightened up and burst into another round of laughter. "Oh, this is rich," he said, turning to address his growing audience. "The discount lawyer wants to lecture us about courtroom protocol. Tell me, Bob, is it Bobby? How many federal cases have you handled in your illustrious career?" Robert adjusted his glasses again, but maintained his composure. "I prefer Robert, and I believe my experience will speak for itself when the time comes." Patricia consulted her tablet again, her manicured fingernails tapping against the screen. "According to our research, Mr. Patterson, you graduated from a third-year law school 40 years ago and have spent most of your career handling small claims disputes, traffic violations, and the occasional divorce. The most complex case on your resume appears to be a boundary dispute over a garden shed. Hardly the credentials one would expect for a federal embezzlement case with hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake." The crowd murmured with what sounded like approval for Patricia's verbal assault. Several people nodded knowingly, as if they too understood the importance of hiring expensive legal representation when facing serious charges. Marcus pulled out his own phone, a latest model device that probably cost more than Robert's entire monthly office rent. "Let me show you what real legal representation looks like, Helena," he said, swiping through what appeared to be a contacts list. Patricia here graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. She was editor of the Harvard Law Review and clerked for a Supreme Court justice before joining Hawthorne, Blackwell. Her hourly rate is more than most people make in a week, but when you're fighting for your freedom, you invest in the best. He gestured toward the other members of his legal team. "David Morrison there," he pointed to a tall man with silver hair, specializes in financial crimes, and has a 97% conviction rate when he prosecutes federal cases. "Jennifer Walsh," he indicated a petite woman with intense dark eyes, "is our forensic accounting expert who can trace money trails through the most complex corporate structures. And Thomas Kendrick, our youngest team member, graduated first in his class from Stanford and passed the bar exam with the highest score in California history." Helena felt the walls of the courthouse corridor closing in around her. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter and harsher, casting unflattering shadows across her face, while Marcus and his team stood in what looked like spotlights designed to showcase their success and power. "You know what I find most amusing about this whole situation?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine entertainment. "You actually thought you could steal from my company and get away with it. Meridian Financial is my baby, Helena. I built that company from the ground up, and every single transaction, every single penny that flows through our accounts, ultimately comes back to me. Did you really believe that someone like you could outsmart systems that I designed and implemented personally?" Robert cleared his throat softly. "Marcus, I believe there may be some misunderstandings about the nature of these charges and the evidence supporting them." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, please, spare us the amateur dramatics. The evidence against your client is overwhelming and ironclad. We have digital transaction records, computer logs showing exactly when and how the money was transferred, and security footage of Helena accessing accounts she had no authorization to touch. She's going to prison, Robert, and the only question is whether she gets the minimum 15 years or if we push for the maximum penalty to make an example of her." Patricia opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "Mr. Patterson," she said with mock formality, "these are copies of the evidence we will be presenting. Bank records, computer forensics reports, witness statements from Meridian Financial employees who observed Mrs. Vasquez accessing sensitive systems, and expert testimony from cybersecurity specialists who tracked the digital fingerprints of every unauthorized transaction." The papers in Patricia's hands seemed to represent Helena's doom made manifest, hundreds of pages of technical evidence that would paint her as a calculating criminal who had betrayed the trust of her employer and stolen money that belonged to hard-working people planning for their retirement. Helena's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. "I didn't steal anything from anyone." Marcus laughed so hard that tears appeared in the corners of his eyes. "Oh, Helena," he said, wiping his face with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. "Even now, even when the evidence is staring you in the face, you're going to stick with that pathetic story. Do you have any idea how desperate that makes you sound?" The courthouse clock chimed, signaling that court would resume session in 10 minutes. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to disperse, most shaking their heads sympathetically at Helena's obvious predicament while casting admiring glances at Marcus and his impressive legal team. As people walked away, Helena could hear fragments of their conversations. "Poor woman doesn't stand a chance against lawyers like that. Should have hired better representation if she was going to try something that stupid. That's what happens when you try to punch above your weight class." Marcus straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the polished surface of his phone screen. "Helena," he said in a voice that managed to sound both condescending and pitying, "I want you to understand something very clearly. In 10 minutes, we're going to walk into that courtroom, and my legal team is going to systematically destroy every pathetic defense that your bargain basement lawyer tries to mount. By the end of today, you'll be in federal custody awaiting sentencing, and everyone who matters in this town will know exactly what kind of person you really are." He leaned down one final time, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Helena's ears. "You should have stayed in your lane, sweetheart. You should have been content being the nobody you always were instead of trying to steal your way to something better. Now you're going to lose everything, including your freedom, and there's absolutely nothing that your discount lawyer can do to save you." The courtroom doors opened with a heavy thud that seemed to seal Helena's fate. Marcus strutted through the entrance like a conquering general, his legal army flanking him in perfect formation. The bailiff announced the resumption of proceedings, but Marcus seemed to view it as his personal stage debut rather than a solemn legal proceeding. Helena walked steadily behind Robert Patterson, her steps measured and deliberate despite the overwhelming circumstances. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that Marcus apparently found irritating because he made no effort to hide his continued amusement at her situation. "Before we go in there and watch your pathetic little lawyer embarrass himself," Marcus announced loudly enough for the remaining courthouse observers to hear, "I want everyone here to understand exactly what kind of person Helena really is." He turned to address the small crowd that had followed them toward the courtroom entrance. "This woman," he declared with theatrical emphasis, "lived in my home for 8 years, spent my money, enjoyed the lifestyle that my success provided, and the entire time she was planning to rob me blind." Helena's jaw tightened, but she continued walking without responding to his accusations. Her silence seemed to frustrate Marcus, who clearly expected a more dramatic reaction to his public humiliation campaign. Patricia Hawthorne stepped closer to the gathering crowd, her tablet already displaying what appeared to be financial documents. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in her razor-sharp voice, "what you're witnessing today is a textbook case of financial fraud perpetrated by someone who felt entitled to money she never earned. Mrs. Vasquez systematically embezzled funds over a period of 18 months, thinking that her position at Meridian Financial gave her both access and immunity." Robert Patterson paused at the courtroom threshold, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with the same calm precision Helena had noticed throughout their consultation meetings. She had initially worried about his quiet demeanor, wondering if he possessed the aggressive instincts necessary to challenge Marcus's high-powered legal team. But something about his unshakable composure had gradually become reassuring rather than concerning. Marcus noticed Robert's pause and interpreted it as hesitation born from intimidation. "Having second thoughts there, counselor?" Marcus called out mockingly. "It's not too late for you to recommend that your client find more qualified representation. I'm sure there are public defenders available who might have slightly more experience with federal criminal cases." Helena found herself remembering the methodical way Robert had reviewed her employment records during their initial meeting. While other attorneys she had consulted seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the financial accusations, Robert had studied each document with the focused attention of someone solving an intricate puzzle. His questions had been precise and probing, revealing an understanding of corporate financial structures that surprised her. The courtroom filled quickly, with Marcus's supporters claiming the front rows behind the prosecution table. Helena noticed how they whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from pity to outright disdain. Several of them appeared to be Meridian Financial employees, people she had worked alongside for years who now seemed to view her as a criminal betrayer. David Morrison, the silver-haired prosecutor, spread an impressive array of documents across the prosecution table. File boxes lined the wall behind him, each one labeled with dates and categories of evidence. The sheer volume of material seemed designed to overwhelm both the defense and any observers who might question the thoroughness of the investigation. Marcus settled into his seat directly behind the prosecution table, positioning himself so that Helena could see his satisfied expression throughout the proceedings. He leaned forward and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. "You know what really gets me about this whole situation," he said to Patricia, "is the ingratitude. I gave Helena opportunities she never could have earned on her own merit. I brought her into Meridian Financial when she was nobody, working dead-end administrative jobs with no real prospects." Helena's fingers tightened around her pen, but she began taking notes with the same systematic approach she had used throughout her professional career. Her handwriting remained neat and legible despite the stress, and she organized her observations into carefully labeled categories that would have impressed any efficiency expert. Robert noticed her note-taking method and nodded approvingly. During their preparation sessions, he had been struck by Helena's ability to recall specific dates, times, and details with remarkable accuracy. When he asked her about particular transactions or workplace interactions, she could provide not just general recollections, but precise chronologies complete with supporting context. Patricia stood and addressed the judge, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to courtroom victories. "Your Honor, the prosecution will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant engaged in a sophisticated scheme to embezzle $400,000 from employee pension funds at Meridian Financial. We have digital evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis that establishes both the defendant's guilt and the calculated nature of her crimes." Judge Catherine Brennan, a stern woman in her late 50s, surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who had presided over thousands of cases. She nodded for Patricia to continue, but Helena noticed something interesting about the judge's expression. Rather than the sympathetic attention Patricia seemed to expect, Judge Brennan appeared to be reserving judgment in a way that suggested deep experience with cases where initial presentations proved misleading. Marcus leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the show. He pulled out his expensive phone again and began scrolling through what appeared to be social media notifications, apparently confident enough in the outcome to treat the proceedings as entertainment rather than serious legal business. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, "the defendant held a position of trust at Meridian Financial, where she had access to sensitive financial systems as part of her administrative duties. Rather than honoring that trust, she systematically exploited her access to transfer funds into accounts under her control, believing that her technical knowledge would allow her to cover her tracks indefinitely." Helena continued her methodical note-taking, but Robert noticed that her observations went far beyond simple transcription. She was creating a detailed analysis of each claim, cross-referencing dates and amounts with what appeared to be her own comprehensive records. Her organizational system looked more sophisticated than many lawyers used for case preparation. The prosecution's first witness was called to the stand, a nervous-looking man named Bradley Chambers who worked in Meridian Financial's Information Technology Department. Patricia guided him through his testimony with practiced efficiency, establishing his credentials and his role in discovering the allegedly fraudulent transactions. "Mr. Chambers," Patricia said smoothly, "please describe for the court what you discovered when you conducted your routine security audit of Meridian Financial's computer systems." Bradley adjusted his tie nervously and glanced toward Marcus before answering. "During my monthly review of access logs, I noticed several unauthorized entries into our pension fund management system. The entries originated from Mrs. Vasquez's user account and occurred outside normal business hours when she should not have been in the building." Helena wrote something in her notebook and slid it quietly toward Robert. He glanced down and saw a question written in her precise handwriting. Did Bradley mention that the security system was upgraded 3 weeks before the alleged unauthorized access, requiring all employees to receive new access credentials and training? Robert's eyebrows rose slightly. During their case preparation, Helena had provided him with detailed timelines and technical specifications that demonstrated an impressive understanding of corporate computer systems. Her knowledge went far beyond what he would have expected from someone in a basic administrative position. Patricia continued her examination, clearly building toward a dramatic revelation. Mr. Chambers, what did these unauthorized access logs reveal about the defendant's activities? Bradley consulted his prepared notes. The logs showed that Mrs. Vasquez accessed pension fund accounts belonging to 17 different employees, transferring amounts ranging from $15,000 to $35,000 into what appeared to be external investment accounts. Marcus nodded approvingly from his seat, his expression suggesting vindication for his public accusations. He whispered something to the person sitting next to him, a well-dressed woman who laughed quietly at whatever commentary he provided. Helena continued writing, her pen moving steadily across the page in neat, organized lines. Robert noticed that she seemed to be creating some kind of timeline or cross-reference system, complete with notations that suggested she possessed detailed knowledge about the technical aspects of the case. Judge Brennan interrupted the examination. Mr. Chambers, you mentioned that these transfers went to external investment accounts. Do you have information about who controlled those accounts or how they were established? Bradley hesitated for a moment, glancing toward Patricia for guidance. The accounts were established using corporate paperwork that appeared to bear Mrs. Vasquez's signature and employee identification numbers. However, our investigation focused primarily on the unauthorized access rather than the ultimate destination of the funds. Helena wrote another note and showed it to Robert. Corporate paperwork requires CFO authorization for any external investment accounts. Did Bradley review the authorization protocols or just the computer access logs? Robert studied Helena's question with growing interest. Her inquiries revealed a sophisticated understanding of corporate financial procedures that seemed inconsistent with someone who would make elementary mistakes in embezzlement planning. If she possessed this level of knowledge, why would she leave such obvious digital fingerprints? Patricia moved to her next line of questioning, clearly building toward what she considered her strongest evidence. Mr. Chambers, did your investigation reveal any attempts by Mrs. Vasquez to conceal her unauthorized access to these systems? Bradley nodded confidently. Yes, the log showed that she attempted to delete her access history on multiple occasions. However, our backup systems preserved all the original data, making it impossible for her to completely cover her tracks. Marcus smiled broadly, apparently viewing this testimony as confirmation of Helena's guilt and stupidity. He made no effort to hide his satisfaction, occasionally shaking his head in mock disappointment at what he clearly saw as his ex-wife's pathetic criminal planning abilities. Helena's pen continued moving across her notebook, but Robert noticed that her breathing remained steady and her posture calm despite hearing testimony that seemed to establish her guilt definitively. Most defendants would show visible signs of stress when listening to such damaging evidence. But Helena appeared to be analyzing the testimony with the detached professionalism of someone reviewing a technical report. Robert found himself remembering their first meeting, when Helena had arrived at his modest office carrying 3 file boxes of meticulously organized documents. She had presented him with financial records, employment evaluations, computer system specifications, and chronological summaries that demonstrated an almost obsessive attention to detail and accuracy. The cross-examination would begin soon, and Robert felt a familiar calm settle over him as he prepared to begin what Marcus clearly expected to be an embarrassing display of legal incompetence. But Robert had spent 40 years learning that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared weakest on the surface, and Helena Vasquez was beginning to reveal depths that none of her accusers seemed to recognize or understand. The courtroom fell silent as Robert Patterson rose from his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with the same methodical precision that had characterized every interaction Helena had witnessed. Marcus leaned forward expectantly, clearly anticipating an amateur performance that would provide additional entertainment for his growing audience of supporters. Robert's voice carried clearly through the courtroom despite its quiet tone. Mr. Chambers, you testified that Mrs. Vasquez attempted to delete her access history from Meridian Financial's computer systems. Can you explain to the court exactly what technical knowledge would be required to accomplish such deletions? Bradley shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. Well, someone would need to understand our network architecture, database structures, and backup protocols. It's fairly sophisticated stuff that requires extensive training in enterprise-level systems. Robert nodded thoughtfully. And in your professional opinion, would someone in a basic administrative position typically possess this level of technical expertise? Patricia stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Chambers is not qualified to assess the defendant's technical knowledge or training background. Judge Brennan sustained the objection, but Helena noticed that the question had planted a seed of doubt. She remembered her first day at Meridian Financial 18 months ago, when Marcus had introduced her to the staff as his former wife who needed a job to support herself after their divorce. The condescending way he had presented her qualifications still stung, particularly since he had deliberately omitted crucial details about her professional background. As the testimony continued, Helena's mind drifted to her previous career, the one Marcus had systematically destroyed during their marriage through his relentless criticism and undermining behavior. Before meeting Marcus, she had been Helena Rodriguez, a rising star in forensic accounting with a specialized focus on corporate fraud investigation. Her expertise in financial analysis and digital forensics had made her one of the youngest senior analysts at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious firm that handled complex white-collar criminal cases for federal prosecutors. The irony was not lost on her that Marcus had unknowingly hired his own nemesis when he offered her the administrative position at Meridian Financial. While he saw her as a desperate ex-wife grateful for any employment opportunity, Helena had recognized the job offer as the perfect opportunity to investigate the financial irregularities she had noticed during their marriage but never been able to prove. Robert continued his cross-examination with quiet persistence. Mr. Chambers, you mentioned that the unauthorized access occurred outside normal business hours. Can you specify the exact times these entries were logged? Bradley consulted his notes again. The access logs show entries between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. on multiple occasions over the past 6 months. And during those same time periods, was anyone else accessing Meridian Financial systems remotely? Bradley hesitated. Well, yes, actually. Our executives frequently work late and access the systems remotely for various business purposes. Helena smiled slightly, remembering the countless hours she had spent during those late-night sessions, not stealing money, but meticulously documenting Marcus's sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Her forensic accounting background had taught her to recognize the subtle patterns that indicated financial manipulation, and Marcus's operation was far more complex than anyone in the courtroom currently understood. The evidence she had gathered over 18 months filled 4 encrypted hard drives hidden in a safety deposit box that Marcus knew nothing about. Bank records, transaction logs, communication intercepts, and digital forensic evidence that painted a picture of systematic fraud involving not just pension funds, but also client investment accounts, insurance settlements, and regulatory compliance violations. Marcus had been running Meridian Financial as his personal piggy bank for over 3 years, using sophisticated accounting tricks and shell company transfers to hide millions of dollars in stolen funds. His mistake had been assuming that Helena was just another victim of their divorce rather than a trained professional with both the skills and motivation to expose his criminal enterprise. Robert's questioning revealed another crucial detail. Mr. Chambers, these external investment accounts that receive the transferred funds, do you know who ultimately controlled them? Bradley looked toward Patricia for guidance before answering. Our investigation showed that the accounts were established using Mrs. Vasquez's identification, but we didn't investigate the actual account ownership or control mechanisms. Helena had spent months tracing those very accounts, discovering that while they bore her forged signature, they had been established and controlled by Marcus using falsified corporate authorizations. The accounts were part of an elaborate shell game designed to move stolen money through multiple layers of legitimate-seeming investments before ultimately flowing into Marcus's personal offshore holdings. During the lunch recess, Robert and Helena retreated to a small conference room where she pulled out a laptop computer that looked far more sophisticated than anything Marcus would have expected her to own. The machine hummed quietly as Helena accessed encrypted files that contained the real story behind the charges against her. "Robert," Helena said quietly, "there's something you need to understand about my background. The reason I took the job at Meridian Financial wasn't desperation. It was strategic positioning." She opened a file directory that contained hundreds of folders organized with military precision. Bank statements, transaction records, communication logs, regulatory filings, and forensic analysis reports filled the screen in neat categories that demonstrated professional-level investigative capabilities. "Before I married Marcus," Helena continued, "I was a senior forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud investigation. I helped federal prosecutors build cases against executives who thought they were too smart to get caught. When I noticed financial irregularities during our marriage, Marcus convinced me I was being paranoid and jealous. After our divorce, I realized he had been stealing from his own company the entire time we were together." Robert studied the files with growing amazement. The depth and sophistication of Helena's investigation rivaled anything he had seen in his decades of legal practice. She had documented not just individual transactions, but entire networks of financial manipulation that revealed Marcus's true criminal enterprise. "The alleged embezzlement they're charging me with," Helena explained, "represents less than 10% of what Marcus has actually stolen. He's been using my employee access as a way to create a paper trail that points to me while hiding his much larger operation. Every transaction they claim I made illegally was actually authorized by Marcus using his executive override codes." She opened another file that contained recorded phone conversations, email intercepts, and digital forensic evidence showing Marcus's direct involvement in authorizing the very transfers now being attributed to Helena. The recordings captured him discussing the embezzlement scheme with associates, laughing about his ability to frame his ex-wife for crimes he was committing himself. Robert leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. "Helena, why haven't you presented this evidence to the authorities?" Helena's expression hardened with determination. "Because Marcus has spent 3 years building relationships with local law enforcement and prosecutors. Half of the people in that courtroom today owe their careers to political contributions from Meridian Financial. I needed to gather enough evidence to make the case federal, where his local influence wouldn't protect him." She opened a final file that contained communications with FBI financial crimes investigators who had been building their own case against Marcus for the past 6 months. Helena's evidence had provided the crucial missing pieces that transformed their preliminary investigation into a comprehensive federal prosecution that would be announced within hours. "The irony is perfect," Helena said with quiet satisfaction. "Marcus is so arrogant that he actually believes he successfully framed me for his crimes. He has no idea that every move he's made has been documented and analyzed by someone with the exact skills needed to expose him completely." Robert found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the case. Helena wasn't a desperate victim being railroaded by expensive lawyers. She was a highly trained professional who had spent over a year executing a complex investigation that would ultimately destroy the man who had tried to destroy her. As they prepared to return to the courtroom, Helena pulled out a secure phone and showed Robert a text message that had arrived during lunch. "FBI Financial Crimes Unit confirms target arrest scheduled for today at 4 p.m. All evidence packages authenticated and ready for federal prosecutors." Helena looked toward the courtroom doors where Marcus was undoubtedly holding court, basking in what he believed was his moment of triumph over his pathetic ex-wife. In less than 3 hours, his world would collapse completely, and the evidence that destroyed him would come from the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. The afternoon session would proceed exactly as Marcus expected, with his expensive lawyers systematically demolishing what appeared to be a hopeless defense mounted by an overmatched attorney representing a guilty defendant. But the real drama would begin when federal agents arrived to arrest the actual criminal, armed with evidence that would ensure Marcus spent the next 2 decades in federal prison while Helena walked free with her reputation completely vindicated. Robert straightened his tie and gathered his modest briefcase, no longer feeling intimidated by the expensive suits and prestigious law firm credentials arrayed against them. He had never represented a client this prepared or this professionally competent, and he was beginning to suspect that the afternoon would provide entertainment that Marcus definitely had not anticipated. The afternoon session resumed with Marcus radiating supreme confidence as he settled back into his front row seat. His legal team had spent the lunch break strategizing their final assault on Helena's already crumbling defense, and Patricia Hawthorne looked like a predator preparing to deliver the killing blow. The courtroom gallery had filled with additional spectators, drawn by word that the case would likely conclude with a dramatic guilty verdict before the day ended. Judge Brennan called the court to order, but Helena noticed something unusual in the judge's demeanor. Rather than the routine efficiency she had displayed during the morning session, Judge Brennan seemed alert in a way that suggested she might have received information during the recess that changed her perspective on the proceedings. Patricia stood to call her next witness, a forensic accountant named Dr. Gregory Walsh, who had spent considerable time analyzing the financial evidence against Helena. Marcus had specifically requested that Dr. Walsh be added to the prosecution team, confident that his impressive credentials and damning analysis would eliminate any remaining doubt about Helena's guilt. "Your Honor," Patricia announced, "the prosecution calls Dr. Gregory Walsh to present our forensic accounting analysis of the defendant's embezzlement activities." Dr. Walsh approached the witness stand carrying an expensive tablet computer and a leather portfolio that screamed professional competence. His silver hair and distinguished bearing made him look like the kind of expert witness that juries trusted implicitly, and Marcus nodded approvingly as Patricia began establishing his impressive qualifications. "Dr. Walsh," Patricia said smoothly, "please tell the court about your background in forensic accounting and financial crime investigation." Dr. Walsh adjusted his position and spoke in the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to courtroom testimony. "I hold a doctorate in forensic accounting from Northwestern University and have served as a consultant to federal prosecutors in over 200 financial crime cases. My specialty is analyzing complex corporate fraud schemes and presenting technical evidence in terms that judges and juries can understand clearly." Marcus leaned forward, clearly enjoying the intimidating effect that Dr. Walsh's credentials were having on the courtroom. Helena continued taking her methodical notes, but Robert noticed that she seemed remarkably calm for someone whose freedom depended on challenging such an impressive expert witness. Patricia moved to her prepared exhibits, which included enlarged charts and graphs designed to make Helena's alleged crimes appear both obvious and calculated. "Dr. Walsh, based on your analysis of Meridian Financial's records, what can you tell us about the defendant's embezzlement activities?" Dr. Walsh consulted his tablet and began describing what appeared to be an airtight case against Helena. "The evidence shows a systematic pattern of unauthorized access and fund transfers occurring over 18 months. The defendant used her administrative privileges to move money from employee pension accounts into external investment vehicles that she controlled directly. At precisely 3:45 p.m., the courtroom doors opened with an authority that made everyone turn to look. Special Agent Catherine Morrison entered first, her federal badge clearly visible on her navy blazer. Behind her came Agent David Chun, Agent Lisa Rodriguez, and Agent Michael Thompson, all moving with the coordinated precision that marked them as federal law enforcement officers on official business. Judge Brennan paused the proceedings immediately. "Agents, this court is currently in session. How may I assist you?" Agent Morrison approached the bench with a document folder in her hand. "Your Honor, we have federal warrants that require immediate execution. We need to speak with Mr. Marcus Thornfield regarding charges filed this afternoon in federal court." The color drained from Marcus's face as he heard his name spoken by federal agents in open court. He stood uncertainly, clearly confused about why FBI personnel would be interrupting proceedings in what he believed was his moment of legal triumph over Helena. Patricia Hawthorne looked equally bewildered as she glanced between the federal agents and her client. "Your Honor," she said with less confidence than she had displayed all day, "I'm not sure what federal matter could possibly be related to the state embezzlement case currently before this court." Agent Morrison's expression remained professional but stern as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Thornfield is being charged with federal crimes including wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement involving amounts exceeding $15 million. The charges stem from an extensive federal investigation into financial crimes at Meridian Financial Corporation. Marcus felt his legs go weak as the full implications of the agent's words sank in. $15 million. Federal charges. This wasn't about Helena's alleged $400,000 embezzlement anymore. This was about something infinitely more serious that could destroy his entire life. Agent Chin stepped forward with handcuffs clearly visible on his belt. Mr. Thornfield, you need to come with us for processing and arraignment on federal charges. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right until you can consult with counsel qualified to handle federal criminal cases. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the reality of the situation became clear to everyone present. Marcus wasn't a successful businessman watching his ex-wife face justice for her crimes. He was a federal criminal defendant about to be arrested in front of dozens of witnesses, including many of the Meridian Financial employees and community leaders whose respect he valued above everything else. Patricia scrambled to regain control of a situation that had spun completely beyond her expertise. "Agents," she said desperately, "surely there's been some mistake. Mr. Thornfield is the victim in this case, not a perpetrator. He's the one who reported the embezzlement that brought these charges against Mrs. Vasquez." Agent Rodriguez consulted her own documents before responding. "Ms. Hawthorne, the federal investigation reveals that Mr. Thornfield has been systematically embezzling funds from Meridian Financial for approximately 3 years. The evidence indicates that he attempted to frame Mrs. Vasquez for a small portion of his crimes while continuing to steal millions of dollars through shell companies and offshore accounts." Helena finally allowed herself a small smile as she watched Marcus's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The 18 months she had spent gathering evidence, the humiliation she had endured, and the professional expertise she had deployed against her former husband were finally yielding the results she had planned so meticulously. Marcus turned toward Helena with an expression of dawning horror. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom commotion. "You did this somehow. You set me up." Helena met his gaze steadily, her voice calm and professional. "Marcus, I didn't set you up. I simply documented the crimes you were already committing and provided that evidence to the appropriate federal authorities. Everything they're charging you with represents illegal activities that you conducted entirely on your own." Agent Morrison approached Marcus with the kind of patient authority that suggested she had arrested many overconfident white-collar criminals who thought their money and connections would protect them. "Mr. Thornfield, the evidence against you includes bank records, recorded communications, digital forensic analysis, and witness testimony from multiple sources. This investigation has been ongoing for 8 months, and your arrest today represents the culmination of extensive federal law enforcement work." Dr. Walsh, the impressive expert witness who had been testifying against Helena moments earlier, looked stunned as he processed the implications of the federal charges. His forensic analysis had apparently been based on incomplete information that painted Helena as the perpetrator rather than revealing Marcus as the actual criminal mastermind. Judge Brennan addressed the federal agents with professional courtesy. "Agents, given these developments, I assume the state charges against Mrs. Vasquez will be dropped immediately?" Agent Chin nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Vasquez has been cooperating with our federal investigation and providing crucial evidence that enabled us to build this case against Mr. Thornfield. The state embezzlement charges were based on fabricated evidence that Mr. Thornfield created to deflect attention from his own criminal activities." Marcus felt handcuffs close around his wrists as the full scope of his situation became undeniably clear. The expensive lawyers, the intimidating expert witnesses, the public humiliation campaign against Helena, all of it had been based on his fundamental misunderstanding of who held the real power in this confrontation. Patricia Hawthorne stood frozen, clearly realizing that her prestigious law firm had just been publicly associated with defending a major federal criminal whose arrest was being witnessed by dozens of potential clients and professional colleagues. Her legal reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was crumbling as dramatically as Marcus's financial empire. As federal agents escorted Marcus from the courtroom, Helena heard him whisper desperately to Patricia, "Fix this. Call everyone we know in Washington. Use whatever influence we have to make this go away somehow. Agent Morrison heard his comments and addressed them directly. Mr. Thornfield, the charges against you have been filed in federal court with extensive documentation. No amount of local political influence will affect federal prosecution of crimes involving interstate wire transfers, securities violations, and conspiracy charges that cross multiple state jurisdictions. The courtroom doors closed behind the federal agents and their newest prisoner, leaving behind a stunned silence that spoke volumes about how completely everyone's expectations had been overturned. Helena Vasquez, the desperate ex-wife with the bargain basement lawyer, had orchestrated the destruction of one of the community's most prominent businessmen using evidence that federal prosecutors found completely compelling. Robert Patterson gathered his papers with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who had just witnessed justice served in the most dramatic fashion possible. His modest legal practice had never handled a case where the client possessed such sophisticated investigative capabilities or where the ultimate resolution proved so thoroughly satisfying. The courtroom remained in stunned silence for several minutes after Marcus's arrest, with Judge Brennan maintaining order while federal agents coordinated with court security. Helena watched as Patricia Hawthorne frantically made phone calls, clearly attempting to contact partners at her prestigious law firm to explain how their client had just been arrested on federal charges in the middle of what they thought was his victim's criminal trial. Agent Morrison returned to the courtroom carrying a substantial file folder and approached Judge Brennan with official documentation. Your Honor, the federal charges against Mr. Thornfield are based on extensive evidence provided by Mrs. Vasquez over the past 8 months. Her cooperation with our investigation has been instrumental in building this case. Judge Brennan reviewed the federal paperwork with the careful attention of someone accustomed to complex legal documents. Agent Morrison, please explain to this court how Mrs. Vasquez became involved in your federal investigation. Agent Morrison opened her file and consulted detailed notes before responding. Your Honor, Mrs. Vasquez contacted our Financial Crimes Unit 10 months ago with evidence suggesting systematic embezzlement at Meridian Financial. Her background in forensic accounting allowed her to recognize patterns that indicated sophisticated corporate fraud far beyond the simple embezzlement case currently before this court. Helena felt a surge of vindication as she heard her professional credentials acknowledged publicly for the first time since Marcus had systematically destroyed her reputation during their marriage. For years, he had dismissed her expertise as irrelevant book learning that meant nothing in the real world of business success. Dr. Walsh, the expert witness who had been testifying against Helena before the FBI arrival, approached Agent Morrison with obvious confusion. Agent Morrison, I've been analyzing financial records from Meridian Financial for weeks, and I found clear evidence of embezzlement attributed to Mrs. Vasquez. How is it possible that my analysis was incorrect? Agent Morrison's expression remained professional, but carried a hint of sympathy for Dr. Walsh's predicament. Dr. Walsh, your analysis was based on records provided by Mr. Thornfield and his associates at Meridian Financial. The federal investigation reveals that those records have been altered to create false evidence against Mrs. Vasquez while concealing Mr. Thornfield's much larger criminal operation. Patricia Hawthorne ended her phone call and approached Agent Morrison with desperation, replacing her earlier confidence. Agent Morrison, surely there's been some misunderstanding about my client's involvement in any federal crimes. Mr. Thornfield is a respected businessman who reported the embezzlement that brought us here today. Agent Chun joined the conversation, carrying additional documentation that appeared to contradict Patricia's claims. Ms. Hawthorne, the evidence shows that Mr. Thornfield created false documentation and manipulated computer records to frame Mrs. Vasquez for crimes he was committing himself. We have recorded conversations where he discusses his plans to use his ex-wife as a scapegoat for his embezzlement activities. Helena remembered those conversations clearly because she had recorded them using surveillance equipment provided by federal investigators. Marcus's arrogance had led him to discuss his criminal schemes openly, confident that Helena lacked both the intelligence and resources to threaten his carefully constructed operation. Judge Brennan addressed the federal agents directly. Agents, given the evidence you've presented, I'm dismissing all charges against Mrs. Vasquez immediately. This court will not be used to prosecute an innocent person based on fabricated evidence provided by the actual perpetrator. Robert Patterson stood slowly, his modest appearance contrasting sharply with the federal law enforcement presence surrounding him. Your Honor, I believe this would be an appropriate time to clarify some misconceptions about both my client and myself that have dominated today's proceedings. Patricia looked toward Robert with the same dismissive attitude she had displayed all day, apparently still viewing him as an incompetent lawyer despite the dramatic reversal of circumstances. Mr. Patterson, I hardly think this is the time for amateur legal grandstanding. Robert adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled slightly. Ms. Hawthorne, I appreciate your concern about legal competence. Perhaps I should introduce myself properly, since Mr. Thornfield seemed so entertained by my credentials earlier today. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather document case that looked far more impressive than his usual simple materials. Your Honor, I am Robert Patterson, former Chief Federal Prosecutor for the Northern District of Illinois, retired after 38 years of federal service, during which I prosecuted over 400 white-collar criminal cases, including some of the largest corporate fraud investigations in federal history. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the implications of Robert's revelations sank in. Marcus had spent the entire day mocking Helena's choice of legal representation, never realizing that she had hired one of the most experienced federal prosecutors in the country. Patricia's face went pale as she processed what Robert had just revealed. Your Honor, surely Mr. Patterson's background should have been disclosed during pretrial proceedings. Judge Brennan consulted her case files before responding. Ms. Hawthorne, Mr. Patterson filed all required disclosure documents with this court 3 weeks ago. His federal prosecution background was clearly documented in materials that your firm apparently failed to review adequately. Robert opened his document case and withdrew federal credentials that identified him as a consultant to the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. Your Honor, I should also mention that Mrs. Vasquez is not simply a former administrative employee who stumbled onto evidence of corporate fraud. She holds advanced degrees in forensic accounting and served as a senior analyst with the FBI's Corporate Fraud Initiative before her marriage to Mr. Thornfield. Helena felt years of suppressed professional identity returning as Robert publicly acknowledged qualifications that Marcus had spent their entire marriage undermining and minimizing. She had been one of the youngest forensic accountants ever hired by the FBI, with a specialty in complex financial investigations that made her exactly the wrong person for Marcus to target with his embezzlement scheme. Agent Morrison addressed the court with additional details that further illuminated the scope of Marcus's criminal activities. Your Honor, Mrs. Vasquez's investigation revealed that Mr. Thornfield has embezzled approximately $15.7 million over 3 years using shell companies, offshore accounts, and sophisticated accounting manipulation designed to hide the true scope of his crimes. Dr. Walsh approached Robert with obvious embarrassment about his earlier testimony against Helena. Mr. Patterson, I want to apologize for my analysis today. Based on the records I was provided, Mrs. Vasquez appeared guilty of systematic embezzlement. I had no idea that the evidence had been fabricated. Robert nodded graciously. Dr. Walsh, you're not the first expert witness to be misled by sophisticated falsified evidence. Mr. Thornfield spent considerable time and resources creating documentation that would appear authentic to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for signs of manipulation. Patricia realized that her prestigious law firm's reputation was crumbling in real time as their thorough preparation proved to be based entirely on lies told by their criminal client. She made another desperate phone call, presumably to inform her partners that their highest-profile case had just transformed into a public relations nightmare that would require immediate damage control. Agent Rodriguez provided additional context that explained how Helena's investigation had developed over months. Mrs. Vasquez approached federal investigators with preliminary evidence in February. Over the following 8 months, she worked undercover at Meridian Financial to gather the comprehensive documentation needed to build federal charges against Mr. Thornfield. Helena remembered those 8 months as the most challenging period of her professional life, maintaining the facade of a desperate ex-wife seeking employment while systematically documenting crimes that could have resulted in her own imprisonment if Marcus had discovered her true activities. Judge Brennan addressed Helena directly for the first time all day. Mrs. Vasquez, this court owes you an apology for the treatment you've received based on false charges. Your cooperation with federal investigators represents exactly the kind of citizen involvement that makes complex financial crime prosecution possible. Helena stood with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of Marcus's public humiliation campaigns. Your Honor, I simply used my professional training to document illegal activities and provided that evidence to appropriate authorities. Justice requires that crimes be exposed regardless of who commits them or how powerful they believe themselves to be. Robert gathered his materials with visible satisfaction as he prepared to conclude the most dramatically successful case of his consulting career. Your Honor, federal prosecutors will be filing additional charges against Mr. Thornfield based on evidence that continues to emerge from Mrs. Vasquez's investigation. This case represents one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud schemes we've encountered in recent years. As the court session ended, Helena realized that the 18 months of careful planning, professional expertise, and personal courage had achieved exactly the justice she had envisioned. Marcus would spend decades in federal prison, his stolen millions would be recovered for the pension fund victims, and her professional reputation would be completely vindicated by her role in exposing one of the largest corporate fraud cases in state history. 6 months later, Helena Vasquez stood in the federal courthouse watching as Marcus Thornfield was led away in handcuffs for the final time. The judge had just sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, followed by lifetime supervision and complete forfeiture of all assets acquired through his criminal activities. The man who had once mocked her choice of legal representation now wore an orange jumpsuit and faced decades behind bars. The sentencing hearing had drawn a packed courtroom filled with Meridian Financial employees, pension fund victims, and community members who had finally learned the truth about Marcus's elaborate criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors had presented evidence showing that his embezzlement operation had stolen over $18 million from employee retirement accounts, client investment funds, and insurance settlements over nearly 4 years. Patricia Hawthorne and her prestigious law firm had withdrawn from Marcus's representation within a week of his federal arrest, claiming conflict of interest and ethical concerns about their client's deception. Marcus had been forced to rely on court-appointed federal public defenders who, despite their competence, could not overcome the overwhelming evidence that Helena's investigation had provided to federal prosecutors. Helena watched with quiet satisfaction as federal marshals prepared to transport Marcus to his permanent federal prison assignment. During the months of pretrial proceedings, his arrogant demeanor had gradually crumbled as the full scope of his legal predicament became undeniably clear. The confident businessman who had publicly humiliated her in the courthouse corridor now appeared broken and defeated, finally understanding that his money and connections offered no protection against federal criminal charges. Robert Patterson approached Helena with the final asset recovery documentation that would restore the stolen pension funds to their rightful owners. Helena, he said with genuine admiration, I've been practicing law for over 40 years, and I've never seen a more thorough or professionally executed investigation. Your work didn't just expose one criminal. It potentially saved dozens of families from financial ruin during their retirement years. Helena accepted the documents with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her entire approach to bringing Marcus to justice. The federal asset forfeiture had recovered nearly $16 million from Marcus's various hidden accounts, shell companies, and offshore investments. Every penny would be returned to the pension fund victims, with additional compensation provided for Marcus's seized personal assets, including his mansion, luxury vehicles, and investment portfolio. Judge Harrison, who had presided over Marcus's federal trial, had specifically commended Helena's courage and professionalism during the sentencing hearing. Mrs. Vasquez, he had said, your willingness to risk personal safety and professional reputation to expose this fraud represents the highest ideals of civic responsibility. Without your expertise and persistence, Mr. Thornfield would have continued stealing from hardworking people for years to come. The community response to Helena's vindication had been overwhelming and deeply gratifying. Meridian Financial employees who had initially viewed her with suspicion and contempt now understood that she had been protecting their retirement security while enduring months of false accusations and public humiliation. Many had written letters to federal prosecutors praising her integrity and requesting that her role in the investigation be publicly acknowledged. Dr. Gregory Walsh, the forensic accounting expert who had initially testified against Helena based on Marcus's falsified evidence, had personally apologized and offered her a senior position with his consulting firm. "Helena," he had said, "your ability to recognize sophisticated fraud patterns and gather admissible evidence demonstrates exactly the expertise we need for our most complex federal cases." Helena had accepted Dr. Walsh's offer and was now working as a senior forensic accounting consultant specializing in corporate fraud investigation. Her first assignment involved analyzing financial records for a major federal prosecution, ironically using the same skills that Marcus had dismissed as worthless academic theory during their marriage. The Meridian financial investigation had also resulted in additional criminal charges against 3 of Marcus's associates who had helped facilitate his embezzlement scheme. Patricia Hawthorne's law firm faced disciplinary action from the State Bar Association for their failure to adequately investigate their client's background before mounting an aggressive prosecution against an innocent defendant. Helena's professional reputation had been completely restored, with federal prosecutors publicly crediting her investigation as one of the most sophisticated undercover operations they had encountered in white-collar crime cases. Law enforcement agencies were now consulting with her about developing protocols for similar investigations involving corporate fraud and employee victimization. Marcus's sentencing had included a requirement that he pay full restitution to all victims. But since his criminal activities had consumed most of his wealth, the federal government had seized his remaining assets to satisfy the restitution orders. His mansion had been sold at auction, with proceeds distributed to pension fund victims. His luxury vehicles, jewelry, artwork, and investment accounts had all been liquidated to compensate the people he had robbed over 4 years of systematic theft. The federal prison where Marcus would spend the next 25 years was located over 1,000 miles away, ensuring that he would have no opportunity to influence or intimidate any witnesses in his case. Helena had been specifically informed that his prison assignment included placement in a facility known for housing white-collar criminals who required protection from more violent inmates. Helena found herself thinking about the profound irony of Marcus's situation as she watched the prison transport vehicle disappear down the courthouse driveway. The man who had spent months publicly mocking her cheap lawyer and bargain basement legal representation was now completely dependent on court-appointed attorneys funded by taxpayers. His expensive suits had been replaced with prison uniforms, his luxury vehicles exchanged for prison transportation, and his exclusive social circle reduced to whatever relationships he could build with fellow federal inmates. Robert Patterson had become something of a local celebrity following the dramatic revelation of his federal prosecution background and his role in Helena's vindication. Legal publications were featuring articles about his consulting work with the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force, and law schools were inviting him to lecture about complex corporate fraud investigations. The broader legal community had embraced Helena's story as an example of how professional expertise and personal courage could triumph over money and political influence when justice was truly served. Her investigation had been featured in forensic accounting journals as a case study in effective undercover financial investigation techniques. Helena often wondered if Marcus truly understood the magnitude of his miscalculation in targeting her for his frame-up scheme. By choosing someone with advanced forensic accounting training and federal law enforcement experience, he had essentially hired his own nemesis while believing he was manipulating a helpless victim. His arrogance and prejudice had blinded him to the reality that Helena possessed exactly the skills necessary to expose and destroy his criminal operation. As she drove home from the courthouse, Helena reflected on how completely their positions had reversed from that humiliating day when Marcus had publicly mocked her legal representation while confidently predicting her imprisonment. Today, she was a respected forensic accounting consultant working on high-profile federal cases, while Marcus was beginning a 25-year prison sentence with no realistic prospect of early release. The story had generated significant media attention, with local and national news outlets covering the dramatic courtroom reversal and Helena's role in exposing one of the region's largest corporate fraud cases. Interview requests had poured in from legal publications, law enforcement journals, and television programs interested in her investigative techniques. Helena had carefully considered each media opportunity, ultimately deciding to share her story as an educational tool for other potential fraud victims and law enforcement professionals. Her interviews emphasized the importance of professional training, systematic evidence gathering, and cooperation with federal authorities when confronting sophisticated corporate crime. Think about this story for a moment, and let me know in the comments what resonated most with you about Helena's journey from victim to victor. Have you ever encountered situations where someone's arrogance and underestimation of others led to their own downfall? Share your thoughts about what this story teaches us about the power of expertise, patience, and strategic thinking when confronting injustice. Helena's new office overlooked the same courthouse where Marcus had once held court as a confident businessman surrounded by expensive lawyers and political allies. Now she spent her days analyzing financial evidence for federal prosecutors, using her expertise to protect other potential victims from criminals who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable. The final irony was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Helena's vindication. Marcus Thornfield, who had built his identity around superior intelligence and business acumen, had been completely outsmarted by the woman he had dismissed as an incompetent ex-wife seeking charity employment. His 25-year federal prison sentence would provide him with ample time to contemplate how thoroughly his arrogance had destroyed the life he had worked so hard to build.